I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. The film I'm going to discuss today will involve me having to talk about themes of sexual harassment and misogyny. If for any reason you aren't able to listen to that today, then I won't blame you if you skip this one. Hello, my name is Amber and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. It is the last episode of the year, and all year I've been looking at terribly rated LGBT movies, and for the most part I've had a pretty good time. Most of the movies I've actually ended up enjoying quite a bit, and I've always had a lot to say, which is always good. You know, I wouldn't want to come on here and not have anything to say. Unfortunately, the last episode of the year is gonna be a bit of a letdown because I was really hoping to come on here and have something transgressive or contrarian to say about this movie. Unfortunately, I seem to be with the grain. The last episode of the year is gonna be a whimper and not a bang. The movie I'm going to be discussing today is Below Her Mouth.
Hey.
Hey, are you on my street today?
Thought you looked familiar. You come to girl parties often?
I don't come at all.
Terrible news. Can I change that for you?
My friend's waiting for me.
What's your name?
Jasmine?
Dallas.
I'm curious.
About?
Why do women love roofers?
You have to go out with me if you want to find out.
I need to get some air.
Below Her Mouth is a romantic drama directed by April Mullen and written by Stephanie Fabrizi that follows a budding relationship born out of infidelity between the straight-laced, seemingly heterosexual Jasmine and the devil-may-care Swedish lesbian Dallas. If that sounds like a sparse description, that's because it doesn't get more complicated or, unfortunately, more interesting than that. What is compelling and what whipped people up around this movie was the amount of explicit sex between two women, splitting people on the extent that it could be considered pornographic, especially with an all-female crew. In terms of awards, literally the only nomination that I could find for this movie was that it was nominated for Best Romance Poster at the Golden Trailer Awards. I have literally never heard of this award ceremony before, so that's not a good sign. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has a critic score of 21% and an audience score of 47%, so slightly better, but not great. And on Letterboxd, it has a 2.1. So when looking for critical opinions of this movie, I kept coming across the same kinds of things. That there's a flimsy plot with thinly drawn characters and a lot of sex. And, you know, I think those criticisms are fair. I agree with a lot of what is said. When a movie is universally panned by a lot of male critics, I'm usually suspicious, especially because when I go to read their reviews, they are incredibly disrespectful and objectifying towards the lead actresses. And I've come across this a couple of times on this podcast. I haven't always mentioned it, but I really sincerely wish that male film reviewers would just stop talking about actresses like that. That would be fun. I would take your criticism, which I probably would agree with, a lot more seriously if I didn't feel as though you entirely disliked women. It's hard to discuss a criticism like that and not think about the response of, well, there is a lot of sex in it, so how do we talk about a movie that has a lot of sex in it? That is something that I would like to cover in later sections. My opinion is not the way that it is currently being covered. Do something different. But I'm going to read some reviews from Letterboxd. These are some of the most popular reviews on there at this moment in time. So this first one is from Gaby, who says, unimpressed but turned on. This is the most liked review on Letterboxd. It does kind of echo the sentiment that gay people often have to search through a lot of really boring stuff to find themselves represented on screen. And a lot of the time they are very boring films that are also very sexual films. And again, we can talk about that later. It does evoke like a very strange reaction, which I think this review kind of captures, where you're just like, that wasn't really anything, but I guess I liked what was happening in the sex scenes. Is arousal enough to justify praising the film? We'll see. We will discuss it. This next review is from M, who says, "This felt very heterosexual in a way I can't explain." This is something that I did kind of write in my notes when I initially was reviewing the film. I think because the storyline itself feels kind of ripped from like a romance novel where a woman leaves her partner to cheat on him with like the handyman, you know, or like someone lower class than her. It's a pretty common formula. That's where this kind of comes from. I'm hesitant to fully align with that, even though I did write it down initially, because after reading some interviews with the writer Stephanie Fabrizi and also kind of briefly glancing at her Instagram, she does seem to be a gay person and seemed to write this from the point of view of wanting to explore passionate sexuality in a certain way. Even like queer writers can accidentally emulate storylines that are familiar, and whether or not they are deliberately subverting them is up for debate. But I do kind of see where this review is coming from at the same time. And this last review is from Amy Andrews, who says, "Blonde is the warmest roofer." That's a callback. We did that episode last year. You can kind of see the influence of films like Blue is the Warmest Colour everywhere around this period of time. And I'm also curious about the extent that Moonlight, winning the Oscar for Best Picture, influenced the gay romantic drama industrial complex. How like there was an attempt to bring candidness, but also something like mawkish, is that the right word? Kind of like sentimental in a really boring way, if that makes sense. But yeah, there's a specific formula that I think is being followed here. And I haven't watched enough from April Mullen, but I did like glance at her filmography to know that she kind of mostly does high concept genre movies that are usually quite low budget. So this movie is an anomaly in her filmography. And it seems like she is able to identify genre quite well and adapt her work around it. There's quite an intense amount of emulation here. Again, we will discuss in the spoiler section. But for now, I'm going to give a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen this film, if you weren't on Netflix in 2017 and you didn't watch it religiously like me, then I'm gonna end up spoiling it for you. And do you want to know what happens to these lesbians? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Do I recommend you watch this? Probably not. It's really boring. It's really boring for most of it. And if you read the plot synopsis, then you've essentially watched the movie. But still, it's up to you. If you don't want it spoiled, then pause here, go watch it, and then come back.
Why are you being so crazy?
Because I have to wake up early.
Well, we were having a good time.
At my expense.
What?
I should listen to my instincts.
Jasmine, what are you talking about?
She kissed me.
What did you do?
I kissed her back.
What?
I feel sick.
Did you like it?
Claire, I'm not answering that.
I'm just curious.
Well, why would you talk about that? That's not what it's about. I feel really weird.
Because you like her?
Because I'm engaged.
Jasmine, you are the most faithful person I know. You and Ryle are like Mary and the fucking carpenter.
It will never happen again.
Where we'll begin is we'll talk about compulsory heterosexuality versus queerness made symbolic, specifically to symbolize rebellion, which is basically the plot of this film. So Jasmine is a straight-laced, allegedly straight woman who is living a standard suburban life with her boyfriend. She has a job that she likes, she has a nice car, she lives in a massive house, and for all intents and purposes, she seems content. We wouldn't necessarily view anything wrong with her life if the presence of Dallas wasn't there, because Dallas is going through some kind of crisis that she is hiding quite specifically. So she is uninterested in living an attached life, a monogamous life, one where she has a girlfriend, and seems to wholly represent feeling trapped in a certain situation and being able to leave that situation. So the film opens with Dallas breaking up with her quote-unquote girlfriend. I'm not sure that she would describe her as her girlfriend, after they've had sex. And she quite callously does it. There is a scene that follows where she gets a phone call from her ex-girlfriend Jocelyn, and she's very mean to her on the phone. She specifically says, "Don't call again." So we have this contrast of a normal, quiet, pleasant life and one that is kind of deliberately turbulent, and they meet in quite a standard romance / pornographic encounter where Dallas is working on the neighbor's roof near Jasmine's house, and Jasmine is catcalled by some of the workers on the roof, and that is where Jasmine sees Dallas for the first time. Now, after this encounter, we see some cracks in this relationship. Whilst Jasmine comes across as kind of stoic and reserved, it is clear that she does kind of crave experimentation, or at least like whimsy. So there's a scene where she paints her boyfriend's nails whilst he's sleeping, and he calls her weird and asks to take it off. This specifically is the first instance of Jasmine gently pushing against her life, offering some kind of queerness into her life, and it being rejected. Now, we only hear like other instances of this in anecdotes, but it does become more and more clear that she is restless and as a result becomes reckless. So queerness in the movie, specifically, I guess, lesbian identity with regards to Dallas, comes to represent an innate disregard for authority, against simple answers, against typical structures. And whilst I wouldn't argue that this film has an especially complex view of gender, there is this craving for something more malleable that I think Jasmine sees in Dallas, where it is this kind of androgyny that Dallas represents. In very simplistic terms, I think Jasmine could imagine painting Dallas's nails in her sleep and her not really having an issue with it. Now, whether we believe that's actually true is up for debate. Even gender fluidity in the film is discussed within binary terms. So the word tomboy, I think, is thrown around. Don't quote me on this because I'm not entirely sure, but I don't believe the word butch or mask is used at all. Gender itself in the film isn't really up for dissolving so much as it is kind of gently merging as an expression of letting your hair down and going a bit crazy, experimenting with the world, but in the end returning to a safe monogamy that you previously understand. Because even the end of the film seems to imply that Dallas and Jasmine are now in love and going to be together. It's hard to not read that as Jasmine simply trying to replicate something that she already knows, but with slight queerness injected into it. Now, is it fair to expect this movie to fully throw out every single social script tied to gender and sexuality? Probably not. But I do think it is interesting that a lot of these films are still quite invested in mapping lesbian identity onto a recognizable heterosexual dynamic. It does kind of tell me that not many butch lesbian experiences were consulted in the construction of Dallas, because as I said, she mostly exists as a kind of symbol. And it's not really helped that the actress who plays Dallas is inexperienced and as a result not great at it, unfortunately. She's very beautiful, but she's not a great actor, unfortunately. In a sense, Dallas represents active sexuality, something that Ryle, which is the name of Jasmine's boyfriend, Ryle, I'll say that again, does not seem to spark in her. I'm not an expert on butch identity, on mask lesbians, or masculinity in women. I did find the book Female Masculinity by Jack Halberstam, who did like a whole chapter on butch representation in movies, and I wanted to read a little bit from that just to kind of underline what I've been saying. Halberstam says the following: butch representation within contemporary queer cinema has at least partially replaced a butch femme narrative of desire. The butch femme narrative indeed has become a kind of dominant code of lesbian cinema, even where efforts are made to displace it. It's actually kind of refreshing to at least see an attempt to represent a butch lesbian because a lot of the time queer and lesbian representation amongst women are very limited to white, thin, conventionally attractive femme women who are going to lightly kiss each other on the lips and graze each other's thighs, and then that's the extent. And obviously the solution to this kind of representation problem, as is kind of the thing that I've repeated on this podcast, is just more of it. And I think it's definitely too much to ask that this film represents every single identity under the sun, but it is still very limited in what it does show. So, for example, Dallas is a butch or mask lesbian, but she is also the only butch or mask lesbian in the movie. I think that's quite sad. She's just on her own, I guess. But everyone else is relatively femme. We don't see that many. Obviously, it's an indie film. We're not expecting like crowds of people. But it is interesting that all of the gay women are kind of in opposition to Dallas. Like, she represents kind of a soul masculinity. I am just kind of passing through what the film wants me to believe about this relationship, because if you are attempting to make something innately queer about a lesbian experience, about a lesbian lifestyle that a character is trying to fold their way into, I somewhat understand the path of gently introducing them to the easiest to consume. But when you do that, you end up in kind of a problematic space, because when you only show that perspective, who are you excluding from this world? Who's not being seen? It's not just like butch lesbians. There aren't any trans people in this film. And again, we're looking at a very niche section of this world. A niche Canadian gay bar is maybe the extent of the queer life of this movie. Everything else is very sequestered off, very monogamous, very sexual, which is not a problem. It becomes, to what extent are we only representing a palatable version, I guess, of a butch femme dynamic where no other kind of gender diversity exists in the film. And I have to reiterate, because I feel like I'm not saying it enough, I understand that the budget for this is minuscule. And is it too much to ask that your cast is more diverse? Possibly. I think you have access what you have access to. At the same time, it's still worth interrogating. It is trying to represent a version of the world, and this world is maybe too neatly mapped onto a heterosexual one. Can we call this a truly queer narrative if it's too recognizable to what we already know? I'm going to talk about compulsory heterosexuality for a second, because I think it is interesting the way that the film is, in one sense, replacing something rigid with something kind of just as rigid, whilst also trying to interrogate the extent that this character is even able to articulate her own queerness. Jasmine is very against going to what is referred to in the movie as a girls' party, which from my perspective is simply going to a lesbian bar. She's very hesitant to go, but her friend drags her in. She kind of immediately goes to the bathroom and flirts with Dallas straight away. What we get is this repeated denial of desire out loud, but then it's kind of contrasted with the actions of the character, right? They end up kissing on the balcony and she ends up running away from the bar being like, oh my god, I kissed her, and being like scandalized and hoping that her friend will join her in her scandal, when her friend is like, okay, that's okay. She kind of doesn't know what to do with that. It's as if desire itself has to be like completely sublimated in order for her brain to not break, in order for her to kind of gauge how far she has to assimilate with her surroundings. So it's kind of interesting that like the second she walks into the gay bar, she immediately knows what to do. Like, she knows how to flirt with women, and she knows that she's attracted to women. It's not something that she'd ever say out loud. It's not something that she would approve of out loud, and it's something that she has to disavow to her friend just in case there is backlash on her part. We learn of the extent of this kind of sublimation of desire, where Jasmine has oriented her life so much around heterosexuality that it's very much the sunken cost fallacy, right? She's in very deep now. She's engaged to be married, and she's fully ready to commit to this lifestyle. And then this wrench has been thrown into her life, where reflecting on her decisions to not pursue the things she wants becomes incredibly painful to do. And I think that's really recognizable for people who have had to spend a long time in the closet, so much so that they have just kind of accepted that they will have to pretend to be straight for the rest of their lives. It's really hard when you meet someone who is very comfortable with who they are, who very much represents this freedom of desire, when they come to you and they're like, oh, you should just do that. You should just enjoy yourself. You should just have fun. And you're sat there like, how would I do that? So an example in the film is Jasmine tells Dallas that she turned down an opportunity to go work in New York because she didn't want to leave Ryle. And Dallas is immediately like, I would have made you go there. I would have absolutely made you go. In fact, I would have gone with you because that's an amazing opportunity and you should have taken it. It's a really kind of painful moment, I think, because there's a layer of women having to mold their lives around the men in them, even ones that they aren't in a relationship with. It's very much a learned people-pleasing behavior where, because the world isn't made for you, you have to change to the standards that are already in place. We don't know enough about this story. Like I said, it's an aside, really. I think it's in like a montage of them having several conversations at once. We learn this, but we don't know whether she approached Ryle and he was like, I don't want to go to New York, or if she got this opportunity, assumed that he would not shift to meet her where she's at, that he would not want to go to New York, and that rejection would be more painful than if she just assumed what her life was meant to be and just went along with that. There's a real pain of choosing to not be who you are constantly. And I think it's something that queer and trans people are very familiar with. And I don't think that it's something with an easy answer to it, if that makes sense. Because on the one hand, you're like, of course, everyone should be able to dream their dreams and live the life that they want to. But also, if you are dealing with like severe pain of rejection and potential violence, then of course you're gonna retreat into yourself and just pretend to be an average person who has completely normal desires, I promise, so that you don't have to experience that rejection firsthand. Another example we get is that Jasmine had a gay experience when she was a kid, and her mother found out and stopped her from seeing her friend that she had the experience with. It's horrible, but those experiences just inform the way that we go about the world. The essence of compulsory heterosexuality is that you don't believe that what you feel is innately correct. There's this lingering doubt that, yes, you've been experiencing these emotions, but obviously they're false because all the emotions you have are false, because having emotions is bad and terrible and not actually logical and smart. So you should deny them, sublimate them, disavow them, not act on any of them ever. When they do eventually fly out of you, because they will, don't worry, they will do that, you end up kind of severely imploding your life because you've been living a lie for so long, and it ends up just blowing everything up. And that's kind of the climax of the movie, where Jasmine and Dallas are having sex in her house, which they didn't before, and they have crossed a line into the domestic space, the heterosexual domestic space, and they are found out by Ryle, and everything kind of falls apart. And it's to the film's credit, the film emphasizes that this implosion, no matter how painful it is, no matter how painful it is in the moment, is desperately important, because despite the problems I kind of have with the representation of Dallas in the movie, her point of view, to a certain extent, is correct. That we shouldn't be honouring feelings that we don't have. That we shouldn't be living a life that we don't want. And while she is very mean, she is not someone who is living with regret. And I think Jasmine is the opposite, and their respective journeys meet in the middle, where I think the film is arguing that they balance each other out. The opposites attract does somewhat map onto the conventional heterosexual monogamy that I think the film isn't that interested in subverting. What it seems to be arguing is that there needs to be a kind of middle ground where complete unrestricted desire and repressed controlled order are able to meet somewhere where we can be more fluid and also find balance that isn't implosive or harmful to others.
My mom told me if I acted more like a girl, I wouldn't get hurt all the time.
Did you want to be a boy?
I just want her to let me be.
Let's talk about butch lesbians, how they come about and what they kind of represent within lesbian movies. So I will be honest, when I was originally making notes for this film, something I wrote down was, when writing the character of Dallas, was she originally conceived to be a man and then swapped at the last minute to make it more diverse? Or was she conceived as a butch lesbian the whole time? And the reason why I thought that is because the kind of posturing that she does early on in the movie, as well as the kind of misogyny and minor sexual harassment she seems to participate in, kind of paints her as one of the boys, right? Despite the fact that she isn't one and really has no benefit for behaving in such a way. Now, am I arguing that no woman ever can be misogynistic in this way? No. It is unlikely, really, that a masculine woman who is going to experience a very specific intersection of misogyny and homophobia at the same time would go along with this kind of behaviour. When she's on the roof and amongst men who are catcalling women on the street, I want to give her the benefit of the doubt and be like, oh, working in a male-dominated space would cause you to behave like that, except that she owns the roofing company that is doing this work, and she hired those men specifically, and it is unlikely that she is going to fire them because she seems to be okay with this kind of behaviour. Initially, I thought, is this movie just transplanting cis male anxieties onto a lesbian because there is so little representation of butch lesbians that they must simply be men but not? All of the terrible, awful behaviours that men do, Dallas seems to participate in, or at least seems to not have an issue with. She goes to a strip club to be sad. That is like peak male dramedy behaviour, you know? And I can't tell whether this is simply written from the perspective of someone who wants gay relationships to resemble heterosexuality in some way, employing the butch femme dynamic in a way that is familiar in its shortcomings, or when directing this film, no one really knew how to characterize such a thinly drawn character, especially when there is so little butch representation to be seen. Because at the end of the day, not all butch lesbians will be women, you know, some fall elsewhere on the gender spectrum. It is incredibly likely that they will be aware of misogyny, that they may have actually experienced some themselves. So the transplanting of these tropes feels odd and kind of misguided, and coming from a place that doesn't really understand this point of view. Do I feel like an authority on this? Not especially. I do think it is worth discussing how many movies we know that have complex representations of masc women, of butch lesbians, because there aren't that many, really. And I've seen more than I think most people, and even I kind of struggle to come up with some off the top of my head. We covered The Watermelon Woman on this podcast. There's Go Fish, there's Tomboy, there is Stud Life, there's Pariah. See, I've named 5, you know, that's quite a few, and I think some of those are really good. It's still less than the 2 femme women who could vaguely pass as straight, doing gentle softcore stuff to titillate a male audience. It's tricky because there is a lot of really terrible lesbian representation, and when it comes to that diversity within that, it's even smaller, you know? So I think sometimes we feel compelled to defend certain works because there's literally so little that we know that it could be worse. To kind of back up my point of view here, there is a review for Wussy magazine titled Below Her Mouth is Trash and Here's Why, which was written by Chelsea Hogue, who said, Dallas injects the idea that masculine women have to be cut from the same cloth. They lack emotional intelligence and want nothing but sex, cigarettes, and alcohol. I think I brought it up a couple of times. Is it potentially unfair to be expecting this teeny tiny indie movie to be covering all perspectives all at once? Yes, and I think a lot of criticism leveled against this movie would fail to matter if it did feel like a complex exploration of love and identity at the same time. What this movie ends up being is a kind of hollow fantasy that can't really measure its pacing that well. So we have long stretches of tedious dialogue shot in quite boring ways, and then these really interesting long sex scenes that I almost admire for how explicit they are. And I think we've talked about sex. We've talked about sex in movies quite a lot on this podcast, and I think people have brought up blue is the warmest colour, and I discussed that in detail, all of the complexities of the sex scenes in that movie. And I think you run the risk of like legitimately criticising the, I guess, length and importance of a sex scene, of arguing that gay sex in general shouldn't be on screen, that queer desire itself is inherently perverted, and that when we centre media on sex, that we say to the world that this is all the LGBT community is. Something I've reiterated, I think, is that kind of thinking is a dead end, because conservatives will hate you anyway. People who don't like you and think you're a pervert are going to think you're a pervert whether you're fucking nasty or not. And I think it's very important to internalize that. What is difficult, I think, is finding good stuff to say about this movie that isn't about the sex. Because I think when the bulk of your movie is about lust and bodies and fucking, it's great, it's cool. The in-between parts where you're having to balance the complex identities of a butch femme dynamic, of someone coming out of heterosexuality into something more fluid, out of masculinity in women, and what that kind of means. This movie is just straight up not able to juggle all of that. Some of it is a writing issue. I think some of it is also a directing issue. A lot of it is an acting problem, unfortunately. It's a lot of little things that make the experience of this movie incredibly generic, and it does force people to kind of pick at parts of it that in a more competent movie wouldn't really matter. A character being a little bit misogynistic isn't itself a problem, you know. People in real life are misogynistic and they lack emotional intelligence at times, and they, you know, indulge in vices or whatever. When you're representing lesbian identity, unfortunately, you are taking on the burden of trying to undo a lot of terrible film history that has demonized queer people, and also juggle the stereotypes that exist within movies, and also bring a new and fresh perspective to a movie, and also not be misogynistic and homophobic accidentally because you don't realize all this stuff. And it's just not a movie that's able to do that. And I think it is kind of the more openly queer character that suffers from the lack of skill on show here. I feel like I'm being too mean, but it's a lot of factors that just aren't gelling. So in an interview with News 24, Stephanie Fabrizi, who wrote the film, said this: "I wanted to make this kick-ass human being who could take on the heteronormative world. She was broody because she doesn't like the way that things are in the world, but she also has to learn that you can't just go around filling your wounds with other people's generosity, that you have to be a responsible person, and I think when she meets Jasmine, she holds her accountable." On the surface, that makes complete sense to me. I can see that in the movie. I don't think that a lot of that translates because of the performance and because these characters, they're just very two-dimensional. And a lot of the time, Dallas just comes across as an asshole. And, you know, that works for some people. I'm sure people love that. But I think what they were going for is that she's cool and brooding. She's detached, but in an interesting way. But a lot of it just comes across as callous. I love callous and evil women. I love women who do bad things. There was nothing really to identify with here. A lot of what is good about it ends up being aesthetic choices only. We're kind of going back to queerness itself being a representation of rebellion. So when we talked about compulsory heterosexuality, in opposition to that is queerness as something that inherently transgresses, that ends up being a lesson for the more straight-passing character who can go to this kind of projection of what life could be to work out how queer she actually wants to be. Jasmine very much uses Dallas as a way of exploring her own identity. And I think it's not uncommon for the butch woman to get the short end of the stick, to be the more two-dimensional character. And whilst I think there are attempts here to make her more complex, to give her like a backstory and an ex-girlfriend and a roofing company that she owns, it still is kind of drawing on the idea that she is an image to project onto. She's not necessarily a person. And I'm going to read from Judith Halberstam's book, Female Masculinity, again, because she kind of breaks down what the masculine woman on screen tends to be, and we will kind of measure up against that. The masculine woman prowls the film set as an emblem of social upheaval and as a marker of sexual disorder. She wears the wrong clothes, expresses aberrant desires, and is very often associated with clear markers of distinctly phallic power. She may carry a gun, smoke a cigar, wear leather, ride a motorbike. She may swagger, strut, boast, flirt with younger and more obviously feminine women. She often goes by a male moniker. She is tough and tragic. She was a tomboy, and she expresses a variety of masculinities. Now, Halberstam has a very affectionate way of describing masculine women, where they themselves kind of represent what I think maybe more women would like to be than maybe they want to admit. Whilst Dallas does retain a lot of the things listed here, it is worth keeping in mind that whilst all of these things may be true, a lot of the time it isn't the butch lesbian that is the centre of the story, that's the one going through this kind of journey, that they are often the catalyst for another person to have their awakening, their journey. And as I said earlier, and what I said at the beginning of this section as well, is it worth exploring the extent that this relationship is simply meant to represent a heterosexual dynamic? And is that a fair thing to even argue, to equate a butch femme dynamic with a straight relationship? Maybe not. I don't feel as though the film is able to tell the difference.
You didn't even see me. Standing there, you were gone.
She's a woman.
That doesn't matter.
Tell me what I need to do to fix this. To put us back on track.
But you're a lesbian.
You've known me for almost 7 years.
Yeah, I thought I did.
I still love you. Nothing has changed between us.
I saw it with my own eyes, Jasmine.
I can't lose you.
End it.
It's over.
No, I want you to end it in person. You'll never see me again.
In this final section, I'm going to talk about the thing that you may actually be here for in the first place, which is this pornography? Is there too much sex in my indie drama? When outlining the parameters of the lesbian sex scene, Kendall McLean from Outfront magazine said the following: women are in seemingly uncomfortable positions to have sex, so they may look more attractive for the viewer. They're not having sex to move forward in their relationship, or even really for their interest at all. Rather, they're intimate to appease the viewer. Sex is filmed as a voyeuristic exploration of male interest as opposed to an intimate moment. Now, there is a very good chance, if you read a lot of criticism of queer movies, that is a completely familiar argument to you. And in some cases, it is something I would definitely agree with. What I'm going to push back on is the extent that it can be applied to every single lesbian sex scene, and I'm even going to include some of those written and directed by men. Now, you may hate me for this. You may be lighting your torch and getting your pitchfork ready as we speak, but I'm going to ask you to pause for 1 second and ask, what is informing your reaction to a sex scene? Is it simply that you personally did not find it pleasurable to watch? Or are you uncomfortable with the depiction of sex on screen in general? I think these are all very important questions. The constant conversation about sex scenes in movies, a lot of the time it is presented as objective truth about misogyny, about the legitimacy of them, the point of them. But it does very much come up against why the immediate response to something pleasurable on screen is giving you such a negative reaction. Is it a moral panic that you're having, or when we look at the scene, is it very mechanical and objectifying and not realistic? I'd even counter the realism part of it, because sometimes I want a sex scene to be bombastic and out of this world and not especially realistic, because I go to movies to not be in the real world. I make a movie podcast because of that reason as well. I'm sympathetic, and also I do agree with some of the arguments about the male gaze and how women have been treated on film sets, and the extent the female body has been used as symbolic for a lot of different things, not just pleasure, but elements of sadism and suffering. And I will bring them up when I feel especially offended by them. What I don't enjoy is this kind of broad dismissal of any kind of sexuality on screen. I have to be vocal about it, because the one thing that I enjoyed about this movie was the sex scenes. I thought they were well constructed. I thought that they were tense and well paced. I thought the technique was good. When I read reviews like this one in Slant magazine that argues that it is an unquestionably pornographic fantasy, barely trying to pass as something other than masturbation material, or this review from LA Times which says the film treads into exploitative territory, with the ratio of screen time given to writhing female bodies far outweighing that given to their unique experiences as gay or closeted women in the world. I ask, what is so great about dialogue? Now, this is the part that may be controversial, because I maintain that this movie isn't very good. That when I watched it for the first time, which was several years ago, probably on Netflix, what was compelling to me was not actually the complexity of the relationship, but the representation of sex as a kind of connection. Not just a kind of connection, but a legitimate connection. And that meaningfully staging sex scenes is a hard thing to do. It's hard to make look pleasurable. But when done well, it can be a kind of translation of repressed desire, which is something that we've talked about a lot on this episode, where, at least in the early section, where a big part of Jasmine's identity is that she hasn't been able to articulate how she feels. The only thing that comes out of her mouth is a kind of shame, but where she excels is in her physicality. She wants to kiss Dallas, she wants to have sex with Dallas, and it's something that she pursues repeatedly, to the point where they are actively in Jasmine's home, and in the domestic space, she is able to find a comforting kind of queerness in this, and it's through sex. And I think, for me, that is a legitimate journey, even in a very generic story. If this story was better, then I'm sure that my compliment would hold more weight. But to argue that something is pornographic because it has a lot of sex in it, because it's very explicit, because the nudity proliferates throughout the story, one, it seems to not be trying to engage with it where it's at, and two, it's hard to not read as kind of homophobic. Now, I struggle to legitimately throw stuff like that around, but it seems very easy for people, even people who are gay themselves to call queer media that they don't like degenerate or pornographic or perverted, and not ruminate on the implications of using that kind of language on exclusively gay and lesbian media. At the same time, and this is a potentially stronger argument than I believe a lot of the reviews of this movie were able to give, is one I'm going to take from Teresa de Lauretis, who argues in her book The Practice of Love, Lesbian Sexuality and Perverse Desire, simply casting two women in a standard pornographic scenario, or in the standard frame of the romance, and repackaging them as a commodity purportedly produced for lesbians, does not seem to me sufficient to disrupt, subvert, or resist the straight representational and social norms. When it comes to engaging the spectator's fantasy and identification, a film's effects are neither structural nor totally structured by the film. Rather, they are contingent on the spectator's subjectivity and subjecthood, which are themselves, to some extent, already structured, but also opened to restructuration. De Lauretis argues very much that the lesbian sex scene itself is not inherently transgressive, and that it very much depends on the actual person and their lived experience, the extent that a representation of lesbians is going to work for them. And I think that is very much, it's not really an argument against male gaze theory, in that I think there is still an acknowledgement that the mechanics of film are still structured around the woman being observed and the spectator being perceived as male, structuring their worldview around women being looked at. When trying to construct an idea of the lesbian spectator, the extent that you are going to both identify and indulge in a certain kind of fantasy does depend on how far you invest in it. A lot of the time, especially when it comes to media criticism, we tend to assume that our experience of a movie is going to be universal and that we kind of have the last say on what a movie means. The filmmakers of this movie can legitimately believe that they are doing something transgressive, and people can respond to it with confusion as to why the movie only really flourishes in its sex scenes and not otherwise. We can believe them when Melissa Cochland said in an interview with the Toronto Star that the sex scenes are very bold and very daring and they require a lot from the two actors. And as well as April Mullen saying a true, honest, simple female perspective on what women do together and what people do when they are falling in love through the eyes of a woman. And the fact that this movie had an all-female crew and still wanted to construct a story this way, it might force us to have to reevaluate the extent that we only associate explicit sex with a male point of view. And I don't think that it's enough, in my opinion, to simply call this film pornographic and then move along. Especially when so much of the press around this movie was like, we made this movie because we want to celebrate the female orgasm on screen, and we wanted to show strap-ons, which you rarely see. And then, you know, you read reviews and no one seems to like it that much. They seem to dismiss it outright. That doesn't feel right to me. I often have to put myself in the position of defending a movie's choices and not even really liking the movie that much because I don't enjoy the way movies by women are talked about, women in the movies are talked about, the way sex is talked about, the way gay sex is talked about. None of it feels right. And I have to dig very far to find like a legitimately interesting and complex analysis of stuff. And it's just annoying. It's just annoying. I'm going to end this section by reading an article written by April Mullen for Movie Maker magazine about the process of making this movie to kind of underline the opinions about sex on screen. The female voice desires all things sexual, all the way down to the female orgasm, are seldom represented in film, television, and advertisements. 99% of my exposure to sex in film, TV, and media is written by a man, directed by a man, and made to turn men on. This fact was something that was always on my mind while filming Below Her Mouth. I had to constantly remind myself to forget all of the movie sex I had seen before. Instead, I reflected inwardly on what turned me on as a woman, what my inner desires were, what made me want to be physical with another person. These are the moments I wanted to bring to the screen. Does this film look like a badger? I feel like we already know the answer to this. Mostly yes, but there are still things that I like about it. So it was very in vogue post-Moonlight to release romantic dramas about gay angst. Even for this kind of film, it is mostly generic and dull. The only interesting thing about it is its portrayal of sex, which ends up dominating the conversation around this film, where I assume the filmmakers were looking for something slightly deeper here. These are two very hot women who have zero chemistry with one another, which doesn't aid the experience or the analysis that this is just masturbation material. Something I hope I have successfully argued against, but we'll see. So, I have two recommendations. One of them you will recognise if you've listened to this podcast before. So the first is Saving Face. Now, this is one of my absolute favourite movies. It's directed by Alice Wu, who I love, and it's diabolical that Alice Wu has only directed 2 movies because she is a genius, especially when it comes to romance. So this is a movie about a surgeon who very suddenly has to take in her mother, who falls pregnant, and at the same time she is having to hide her gay identity from her Chinese family. It's a movie about covert sexuality and becoming closer to your parents once you realise you have the same flaws, i.e. avoidance when it comes to intimacy for fear of pain and rejection. And the second recommendation is Andrew Haig's Weekend. Now, I did a whole episode on this movie, so although it was a couple of years ago, I can't argue that it holds up because I haven't been back to listen to it. If you are interested in my complex thoughts about that movie, then go listen to that episode. I'm recommending it here because it is also about 2 people falling in love in a short period of time and exploring their identities and the idea of love in general. And it's probably one of the best movies to ever exist. I love it deeply. I would watch it all the time, except it makes me really fucking sad. That's the end. We're done now. In fact, we're done for the year. Can you believe it? 2025, a fucking shit show. Absolute nightmare. Cannot wait for it to end. Very excited for next year. I have big plans for next year. I'm very excited. I'm going to be worn out though. Because I think it's going to be so much work. Thank you for listening. I'll be back in January for season 5. I hope to release a trailer for that season early in January. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter @LikeABadgerPod. Follow me on Spotify, YouTube, and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. All of the links will be in the description. If you'd like to read some of my writing, you can visit ambercomwalk.com. All of my sources are in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you next year. Goodbye, good luck. I hope 2026 is going to be better. Please let it be better. Bye.